The last speaker is Mr. Li Hong. He's from the embassy of the People's Republic of China. He is a minister councillor, but also the permanent representative of the embassy to the SCAP, United Nations SCAP. So, Mr. Li Hong, I know that there are a lot of issues, and thank you for coming today. I don't want to put you on the spot, but China is the biggest actor, player, power around here. So there are many issues and many roads that lead to Beijing. And so we all want to understand and come to terms and somehow learn about China's intentions, objectives, and ways and means. So we would like to listen to you. Please.
Thank you, Dr. Thitinan. It's a great pleasure for me to be here to share my personal perspective on this issue. Water, I think, is really a very important issue for our daily life, for the world. So I think this topic is really relevant to the region, and we shared the Mekong River in this region, and we shared the water in the South China Sea. This provided the basis for us to cooperate and to live together in this region. I would like to share first 4 points on South China Sea, and then perhaps a few words on Mekong. As for the South China Sea, the first point I would like to say is about China has inherited, South China Sea is the inherent territory of China. As a diplomat, I have to say that, otherwise I will lose my job. But this is not just because of the position. We have 4 arguments and records and facts for that. China is the first to have discovered, named, and exploited the South China Sea and the relevant waters. A lot of historical literatures chronicled the activities of Chinese people in the South China Sea, and a number of foreign documents also recorded the fact that during a long period of time, only Chinese lived and worked on South China Sea islands. So China's sovereignty over the South China Sea islands and relevant rights and interests in the South China Sea water have been established in the long course of history and are solidly grounded in history and law. So actually, there were very few disputes before 1970s over the territory issues in South China Sea. So this is the first point I would like to talk about. I have no intention to argue this issue with other colleagues. Second, I would want to say the disputes over the South China Sea, even in the last 20, 30 years, is not so big an issue in our region. Cooperation is the major theme of this region. Even in the South China Sea, the stability, the peace were there in the last 30 years. No substantive conflicts, no substantive arguments, quarreling over this area. So we should not amplify the disputes over the South China Sea. For the countries in this region, we have much more in common. We have much to cooperate. The most important thing for us is to cooperate for our economic development, I think, at the moment. And all countries have common understanding on this issue. So as for the disputes over territory, this is also not so serious an issue. China have a lot of neighboring countries. We used to have a lot of territorial disputes with our neighboring countries. But we have tried through the negotiation to solve such disputes with our neighbors. 12 of 14 our neighbor countries have already finalized the territory negotiation, and we have demarcated with these countries on land. And on the water, perhaps people say water is more complicated. All the issues related to territory are complicated. Even on water, we have delimited the 北部bay, 北部湾, we say 北部 bay, with Vietnam. So water issues, we can also find solutions as long as we hold a good view, cooperative spirit. So we should not exaggerate the disputes on this issue. And I said China has solved so many territory issues with our neighbors. This indicates that China is ready to negotiate with the relevant parties to settle the disputes. We recognize the disputes with some of the countries in this region over the South China Sea. And we should try to solve it through negotiation, through peaceful means, through our cooperation. And ASEAN has been playing a very important role. So this is the second point I would like, I try to mention about. The third point I would like to talk about is nowadays, the situation in South China Sea is developing on the right track and is moving in the right direction, as our previous colleagues have mentioned. The single text for COC has been agreed, and it is going 3 readings through the relevant mechanisms. I suppose it might be ready to submit to the Prime Minister's summit later this year, I hope. So these are the right direction. Of course, we have seen the noise 2 years ago. So that's a wrong direction. And now we are moving in the right direction. We're trying to set the rules among us, between China and ASEAN countries and relevant sovereignty countries to talk about this issue, to set rules, to manage the risk, and to cooperate for economic purpose. Actually, China has been proposed to have this put aside the sovereignty issue and let's try to cooperate for the economic benefits, for the development of resources in this region. I think these are very practical ideas, but sometimes it's ignored by some of the parties. So we need to pay attention to this aspect. China is very constructive, I think, is very reasonable and rational on this issue. With the current cooperative atmosphere, I am confident we will make the South China Sea a more and more peace and stable region for our economic and cooperation. So the fourth point for South China Sea issue I would like to address is about the role of the outside superpowers. What is the role the superpowers played from outside the region? I think this is crucial to the situation in this region. While China and ASEAN have been making progress, there are always some outside players or partners. They want to intervene, they want to meddle. I am sure we are, as Chinese, we are open to such role, but we think the role should be constructive, positive, rather than destructive. Frequent military drills, very advanced reconnaissance, warships swagering in front of this region. It's not helping the peace and stability in this region. It's sending some wrong signal to some of the claimant countries on this South China Sea territory, islands. So you should try to help us to solve this issue in a constructive way, to facilitate dialogue and peace, rather than doing the different things. So again, I would like to reiterate that China is the country which I think is the most country that wants peace, stability in this region. Nowadays, China is developing in a new phase. We're talking about high quality economic development. We are trying to provide better life and well-being for 1.4 billion people in our own land. We need prosperity from South China Sea. We don't want to see the disturbances in this region. So we are ready to talk, negotiate with ASEAN countries and relevant parties in this region to settle our disputes. So with such goodwill, I am confident we will making progress on this issue. In regard to the Lancang-Mekong cooperation, or in general as a water issue in the river, I would like to emphasize some basic ideas. First, in our Chinese view, water is a resource. It could bring benefits and economic benefits and life benefits for us. So we should try to make use of it. Second, when a river is transboundary in nature, it really complicates the issue of how to balance the interests among different countries on the riparian countries. So this issue is in our Asians' view, not only Chinese view. I think our Asian culture is believe more on this dialogue and cooperation, rather than based everything could be settled through the legal way, through a law, a convention. Convention plays an important role. But some of the issue is hard to be solved by the legal system. As well, our colleague mentioned about the Convention on the International Water Course. So many countries, not only China, many countries have not signed this convention. But in Lancang-Mekong, in the past 20 years, China has kept close dialogue with MRC, an institute which belongs to the lower Mekong countries, which is playing important role for governing the water-related activities. So such dialogue, I think, is an effective approach for us to address our concerns, to express our interests, to share the prosperity of this region. As for Lancang-Mekong cooperation, which I fully agree, this is initiated by our Thailand colleague, the Foreign Minister of Thailand. And later, China jointly together with these 6 countries promoted this mechanism. Now it's playing a very important role in this region. I think it covers a lot of area. Environment, water, countryside development, urbanization, connectivity. So almost cover everything in this region. And it has summit meeting between our prime ministers, ministerial level meeting among our foreign ministers, and senior level officials meeting twice a year. That's quite frequent. And we have secretariat at each country. We have this water resources center and also environment center. So these mechanisms are very comprehensive. They could play a very important role for governing the discrepancies among us. I am confident, based on this cooperative spirit, we will handle the water disputes, if there are any disputes over the water issues, well. And I can stop here. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, the floor is open for questions and comments. Mr. Lee Hong, I just have to ask you first, you know, the LMC, if you don't have the LMC, why not just join the MRC and work with the MRC? Why LMC?
Thank you. First of all, LMC is a legally binding organization, in my understanding it. So it has 4 members already there. And in our understanding, MRC is more focused on the regulating of the water development or water governance. But LMC is much more broad a mechanism. Actually, it has 3 pillars: political and security pillar, and economic and sustainable development. The third one is water. The third one, yeah. The third one is cultural. It's cultural and people-to-people exchange. Third pillars. I have 5 priorities. Water is one of the priority areas. So they are at different level. One is more comprehensive. One is more focused only on water-related issues. So as for the relations of China to MRC, we have been a very active dialogue partner with MRC. In the past several years, I think the cooperation is very substantial, not only dialogue, but also very substantial, tangible cooperation has been promoted. We have joint seminars, workshops, discussing about what we talking about sand issue, sediment issue in the river, the water quality issue, water environment issue, dams, and its impacts to the downstream countries. So such issues are very sensitive, I think, in the past. And China is always trying to avoid to discuss the issue. But in the last several years, we see very active dialogue on this field. Joint research, this is helping us to having a real common understanding on some of the issues. I think such will provide the basis for political trust. Thank you.
Questions, comments? Floor is open.
Before we open the forum for the public, for the guests here, may I try to answer your questions just a little bit? We have quite different viewpoint on Mr. Liu Hong. Actually, on MRC, from our understanding, it's not legally binding. It is a consulting organization, consultory. It's an advisory board, actually, and there is no binding relationship at all. And it is really interesting that Mekong Lan Kwang mechanism at first was Thailand's ideas, not China. I myself participated in the 2 meetings with the former Deputy Prime Minister of Thailand. He visited Vietnam. I don't remember his name, but he proposed many times about Mekong Lancang cooperation, and Thailand sent a lot of delegations, envoys to persuade others in joining with Thailand on Mekong Lancang mechanisms. But Thailand failed, mostly because the political will and the resources on that is very limited. But after the 18-party Congress in 2012, at that time I still very remember clearly that after President Xi Jinping came to power, he needed to change the posture, diplomatic posture of China, and China suddenly seized the initiative and it turned it into Mekong Lancang's mechanism. And the key is different here is that China want to put their political will on that, and China want to lead, and China invested a lot because under the leadership of President Xi Jinping, he want to be leading in other areas, and I think that is the key. Thank you, sir.
I'm layman, not engineer and not technocrat, but we worry about management of Mekong area. I know that in this area, Mekong, we have big men, I mean China. I worry about that. Well, I worry about that for behavior of China. In principle and ethic in management of China for Mekong, may I ask Mr. Xi Jinping, please you have your kindness for me, for awareness, for principle and ethic for this area. You are big man. You should to know. Thank you.
I was very interested by Dr. Carl's presentation on this idea of expanding the focus on Lancang Mekong beyond just water to the impacts on the environment, the livelihoods of the communities who depend on the river. What do you see as the role for civil society in influencing that discussion, and is it expanding or contracting?
It was very interesting to hear sort of the progress reports on the Code of Conduct and Development, which is, of course, very encouraging. And with maybe some of your insights that you have, could you maybe enlighten to what extent the decision by the ITLOS court on the South China Sea is actually playing a role, or is being reflected, or is a reference or relevant to the negotiations, to what extent its principles that it established are actually reflected, or will be reflected, or will likely be reflected in the Code of Conduct?
I think actually, Mr. Lee Hong, perhaps you can address, this is the concern of China's smaller partners who are concerned about, we have had news about the debt traps, for example, of the Belt and Road. For the Mekong region, I think that there are concerns for smaller countries downstream, let's say Cambodia, in particular Vietnam, who may not have as much of a choice and leverage in dealing with China. So they have to kind of rely on China's, what the gentleman said, ethics and goodwill. Is that forthcoming? And then the role of civil society in LMC. I think, Carl, maybe you can answer that. And then the PCA ruling, this is we'll take that as the last question. I think the PCA ruling it was a watershed ruling in July 2016, awarding pretty much on all counts to the Philippines. Yet President Duterte has put the PCA decision aside in dealing with China, but this has led China to become more accommodating. So I want to ask Mr. Lee Hong and others that, is this the way that China wants to deal? No outsiders, no international law, it's just China and the partners, and if that's the case, then that's when China will become more flexible and accommodating. Is that the case? We'll start with Carl first. I think we'll come this way. Go ahead, Carl. If you would, the LMC, role of civil society, how much impact and what kind of role?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. I think LMC has been learning over the last couple of years the need to somewhat engage more with civil society, but nowhere near as extensively as MRC. So if you look at the activities on this is LMC specifically for water, but I would comment more broadly, as Mr. Lee Hong mentioned, it's a far wider program, so it has involved a number of scholarships for university students to go and study in China, as well as student exchanges, for example. So there is that ongoing, but I think I would treat that differently from actual influence on decision making, which is still opaque. Most recently, the Global Water Partnership, which is, I guess, a state-sponsored process that collaborates with civil society, has built a partnership with, so China Global Water Partnership has collaborated with the LMC, and apparently that will lead to a project that will discuss some of the dimensions of water across Southeast Asia, but I haven't actually seen what the outcome of that would be yet. I'm not sure if it's happened. There's also been some research that Mr. Lee Hong mentioned in Laos and in Thailand as well. And maybe this then also points, there's civil society of the more troublesome sort that I think are still struggling to find a voice and an influence on the LMC. Then there's the more disciplined sort that I think maybe academics and some larger civil society groups that are maybe more research focused that are starting to find some spaces. But I think maybe there might just be a sort of final comment more broadly on the political or civic space across the region at the moment that overall limits the possibilities of civil society to influence government-led initiatives. Thank you.
Would you say, Carl, that before the LMC, when we had the MRC and Mekong Agreement, Mekong Institute and so on, civil society had a much bigger role, a more kind of a impactful kind of role, because LMC is driven by China and therefore civil society not as effective. Would you say that?
I think it depends upon the projects that we're talking about. If we're talking about the Lanchang dams in China, I think the downstream countries' civil society and even international civil society beyond that have had very limited impact on the design and the operation of those projects. So I think the space for civil society has more been in the downstream countries. So the Mekong River Commission is one forum in which that takes place. The rules-based dimension and the sense of the procedures for notification, prior consultation agreement did provide an arena for discussion about projects. On the other hand, I think as Dr. Tai was mentioning, I think there's also a limit. It's rules-based, but it's not rules that are legally binding in the same sense. It has a normative power. So I think they could influence the outcome of decisions, but not stop projects per se. And I think an example of that would be the Xayaburi Dam in northern Laos that has gone ahead. It has gone ahead despite opposition, and yet at the same time has been redesigned. I would say the bottom line on that project is it's very unlikely that the mitigation measures that have been put in place are actually going to work.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to come to Dr. Tai. We don't have a Philippine perspective on the panel here, but in the Philippines, there's a lot of debate about the PCA ruling and how much of it the Philippines should abide by or even deploy in part of the negotiations. As far as you know, Dr. Tai, you mentioned the two salient issues on the single draft and the COC. One is the scope, like jurisdiction scope, and the other one is how legally binding. And I think the Philippines and maybe Vietnam would like the COC to be legally binding and ratified by parliaments and legislatures of the involved countries. Have you been surprised at how the PCA ruling has not really figured so far that much in the COC negotiations?
Actually, from my own viewpoint, I think the COC and PCA are two different processes. Even though PCA's ruling is between China and the Philippines, this is the binding parties. But it has impacts, both political and legal impacts on others. But COC is between China and ASEAN. Now talk about PCA. PCA ruling, even though the Philippines refused to implement or China not yet recognize it, the outcome of that. It is in fact It's a case already, the legal case already. And it is a fact there, and no one can deny that. But COC is mostly related so far to political will of the concerned party, especially between China and Asia. That is number one. Number two, so far COC has just gone 3 rounds of negotiations. It just going into the reading text. It means going to the substance, but not yet go too deep. And there are still a lot of things to be done. And I think the next round and the future of negotiating COC, even though it is not using the outcome of PCA, but it has to be based on law in general. And from our viewpoint, we wish it to be legally binding. The more, the better. But I'm not sure. That is point number one. Point number two, that it seems to me, this is my own viewpoint, that China wants to buy time. It takes more time. And I don't know how long it will take. But that's the game. And I think China will use COC to explain to others that this is between ASEAN and China. And it's not your own affairs, and don't interfere. But please be very clear that with regard to water politics, the waterway in South China Sea is open for everybody. Let's talk about Australia. They don't have dispute at all, but they use very, very frequently the waterways across South China Sea. Let's talk about UK. You also have that navigation through this, and many other countries. And from our viewpoint, we divide South China Sea issue into different bits. Bilateral dispute should be done with bilaterally. Multi-party dispute, and we need the multi-party consultations. But legal foundation should be very clear from beginning, and waterways should be open for all. So that is our viewpoint. And we hope COC negotiations should be based on common laws, on UNCLOS, and on what the human beings achieve in terms of law to build the political behavior, rather than separate them into two. Now, with regard to the point a gentleman raised about the big man, China, yes, we agree that China is really important. They control the headwater. They are the upper countries. They did cooperate. China did cooperate. We have to acknowledge that. But the problem that China sometimes, they only cooperate on their will. They don't want to be tied down by any laws. And they don't accept the laws that we accept. That is a big problem. So we are happy to sit down to talk. But the problem is that China really wants that everything is based on their leadership and on their goodwill. So we welcome the cooperation when we welcome the binding norms, whatever it means, if it can produce tangible, substantive, and equal in water use and in other issues related to Mekong. That's fine for us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to come to you last, Mr. Ling Hong, but Khun Kavi, would you say that the process of the COC is going to take a long time, and this is in the interim, we will see maybe more tension because the U.S., the other day, U.S. has flown these B-52s, right? Sortie from Guam, and then the Chinese didn't like it, and U.S. The Defense Secretary Mattis said 20 years ago this would have been very normal, right? But now it's conspicuous. So in the interim, it's going to take some time, I think, the COC. Is it time buying, and then are we going to see more trouble ahead during the interim?
Well, I don't think China can buy any more times, because it has been discussed for too many years already. So I think maybe 2 years, China can only buy time 2 years. And if you want another 3 years, you have to pay billions of dollars. But what I'm trying to say, during this time, 2 years, I don't think ASEAN need a kind of attention from United States, because ASEAN and China are sitting down. I think Dr. Tai has made a very good point that ASEAN and China has sat down and worked on COC. No other country should get involved. So there's no need for America to ratchet up the whatever, the sea lane, the aircraft carrier. And I think it is the intention of the Chinese government, especially leadership of Xi Jinping, to conclude COC. It will impact on future of ASEAN-China relation. A lot of people didn't realize that ASEAN-China relation has not been as good as before in the past 25 years. And that is why BRI in the future, if you want to access BRI success in Southeast Asia region, you can only access on individual countries, ASEAN member. And for the first time, if there is a progress of COC, ASEAN will endorse BRI in an official text. Because until today, ASEAN has never endorsed BRI officially. And a lot of people didn't know. ASEAN only take note of BRI. So it is the interest of China to really show commitment and also whatever it takes to complete the COC. So Mr. Tai said buying time. I said yes, only 2 years. You can either finish COC, make sure that all parties agree. Next year, I think this year is already difficult. Next year, or even better, you can finish it in Vietnam in 2020. So I don't think by this time the tension will be rise and all that ASEAN and China, ASEAN would need that kind of American support.
Okay, thank you, Khun Kavi. Mr. Lee Hong, we have 3 questions about China's goodwill, and I think Dr. Tai made a good point about China's goodwill comes at China's choosing. So it depends on China when and where and how to have goodwill, and this is a concern of the smaller countries. Civil society's role, and there's a question from the Swiss ambassador about the PCA elements, whether that will be incorporated into the code of conduct. I also want to just add here about ASEAN-China. So ASEAN-China maybe should not be viewed in isolation, right? Maybe ASEAN-China is part and parcel of China's dealings with within the Belt and Road Initiative, and also in view of the trade war. So could it be the case that maybe China is just not too spread out now? It's got a lot of challenges on multiple fronts, and therefore maybe China will be more accommodating with ASEAN on the COC, because China doesn't want to fight a big trade war, have a lot of pushback from BRI, from Mahathir and Sri Lanka and so on, and therefore China will then become more flexible with ASEAN on the COC.
Thank you. Actually, I agree most of our previous colleagues, what they have been said. And I see very much in common that we recognize that in this region, we are enjoying stability in general as a whole. And we should continue such cooperation, and we should manage the differences in a very pragmatic manner. As for the LMC or the water issues in this region for Mekong, I think first of all, NGO or civil society could play a role, but the professional expertise is more important. Because for water issues, we need depends on scientists rather than on these NGOs or civil societies. Civil societies, they play a very important role to address the interests of special groups or voluntary groups. But they are not professional experts. They have low special expertise. So we should be very careful. As this university, as the Chulalongkorn University, as teachers, students, I would like to draw your special attention on this issue. This is my personal view, has nothing to do with Chinese perspective. But I have been working on water issues for a long time. Scientists provided the right suggestions for us. We should pay more attention to their views. Of course, we're trying to address the social impacts. So this is the water issue. As for normative or legally binding, for this issue, I think we all have different cultures. This depends on many occasions on the culture. So legal binding is good, but if we could not reach legal binding, political commitment is, in our Chinese view, is more important. This is for Mekong cooperation. As for the China's relations with these small countries, I would like to say Chinese approach is completely from the Western countries. If we see the colonialization of the African countries in the past, if we see the history of this world, look at the history, we will find that the approach is quite different. I used to talking to African colleagues. They always say, oh, when we asking for the loan from the Western countries, they will say, you need to have a good governance. Without good governance, we cannot give loan to you. So while they are trying to have good governance, they're working together to cooperate with countries. After several years, they found they are still in the original position. So this is not so effective. So China is holding a different way. We're trying to cooperate. We respect their culture, their tradition, their philosophy. So we, as for the BRI, we never impose any project on any country. These projects are negotiated in an equal footing basis. And most of the projects, I would like to say, is based on the requests from the countries, from developing countries. And they go through all the laws according to their to the countries. There's no universal stance in the world for environment or for financial credit. We use their own the local law. It's not easy for developing countries to change their law immediately on some of the issues. We respect that. And then we're trying to provide efficiency. So this is the Chinese diplomacy dealing with these small countries. We respect them. We try to provide sincere cooperation. We try to find their priorities, working together to address such issues. We don't set the agenda and ask them to accept. We trying to consult with them. So this is the Chinese policy as a big power as a big country. This next question I will talk about. Yeah, you mentioned about the good view. When you have good view, I think this is hard to answer. But of course, good view comes mutually. Good view plays a role when we have political trust. So in this case, I think political trust is very important. We're talking about the substantive cooperation, we're talking about the early harvest projects. I think such pragmatic, very, very tangible cooperation provided the basis for us to build in political confidence among each other. So, as for good will always play all out, I think at least from the Chinese declared policy, we will keep a amicable, tolerance, and inclusive approach to our neighboring countries. We have special policy to the neighboring countries. This is a priority for our Chinese foreign policy. ASEAN is one of the top region which we have extensive cooperation. As a matter of fact, Chinese president, in my impression, have visited most of the countries in ASEAN. This is the only country our president have visited so frequently to this region. We don't see Lancang cooperation or ASEAN. Lancang cooperation is a Chinese initiative or a Thailand initiative. This is an initiative among this region, among 6 countries. We are working together. Different countries have different contribution to it. China perhaps is more economically strengthened. We provided more financial support, but the contributions from other countries are the same, of the same importance. So this is, I would like to say. And as for the COC, I suppose DOC is a political declaration. COC is in between a legally binding agreement and political declaration. So COC is a little different from legally binding, but also it's also different from just political. Actually, it has, to my knowledge, it has a lot of very concrete articles to stipulate the activities, not only for sharing the waterway, but also for working together how to handle the emergency case. These are very technical. So these are very helpful. One issue, you're talking about the COC it's just based on the political criteria. That's not the case. I think COC's premises is the UN Convention on the Sea of Law. I think all the countries have common understanding on that. COC should respect the rule, the clauses in the Convention on the Law of the Sea. So I have. This is what I want. I try to answer all of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Li Hong. So COC should be consistent with UNCLOS, yeah?
I think COC has no substantive obligation with the convention because these are different systems. This is a convention on the law of the sea is a global convention, and COC is an arrangement between the between the 11 countries in our region. So this is a completely different context.
Okay, thank you. I want to maximize audience time, so there's a bit. We can take another last quick round.
Thank you, Dr. Thitinan. My name's Katie Lynn from the Australian Embassy. We've firmly seen that the South China Sea is now on the ASEAN agenda. So my question to the panelists is, do you see these Mekong issues eventually also being discussed on the ASEAN agenda? And in your respective opinions, do you think that would be beneficial to do so? And what kind of issues could be discussed with respect to Mekong issues on the ASEAN agenda? Thank you.
For any last 1 minute or 2 minute response to the issues that have been put on the table?
I think I won't respond directly to this one. I think maybe Dr. Kavi is better to respond. I wanted to correct myself on one thing. In terms of civil society in China, I think one important organization has been Green Watershed. They've undertaken work on the Manwan Dam that improved the quality of environmental impact assessment on subsequent ones, and also enabled the protection of another river, the Nujiang, which is the Upper Salween. So there is a civil society dynamic within China. The other thing that I wanted to actually try and reframe the debate a little bit, when we think about transboundary water governance, Dr. Thitinan, when you first framed the discussion, referred to the Mekong as a regional commons. And I think the way that we should think about a regional commons, we should also draw upon the idea of Eleanor Ostrom, and she described nested governance. What that means is that intergovernmental cooperation is only one level of governing a river, a transboundary river. So when we talk about nested governance, it means that in the end, communities are the ultimate users of water, and they are coordinated through governments as well as through different levels of civil society. And I think that's really important to appreciate, that when we talk about the need and the legitimate role of civil society groups within a process like the Lancang-Mekong Cooperation Framework, the whole basis would be that we cannot govern just through government. Like, big government from top-down approaches will emphasize large projects. But actually, the living river, the way that individual communities interact with those resources, involve lots of local, small interactions. And so I think the reason why it's important to have lots of voices within the process of transboundary water governance is because of that reason, that in the end, the water is governed locally, nationally, and transnationally. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, if you read carefully the statement made by ASEAN ministers, and you see that Mekong issues have been in the agenda of ASEAN for many years, but of course in different names. They talk about water security on APCS, ASEAN Political and Security Community. They talk about interconnectivity, connectivity in ASEAN Economic Community. They talk about people-to-people and local community-based developments in ASEAN social and cultural community already. So I can tell you that Mekong issues is already firmly on the agenda of ASEAN. But of course, I agree with you that the level of attention from the media and from external partners into Mekong rivers as not much as on South China Sea. So I agree that more effort should be focusing on that, so that we will have more resources, we have more political will for better management of Mekong issues. If you look at the future, you will see that China now is shifting more on mainland Asia. Under the Belt and Road Initiative, you see mainland Southeast Asia is now becoming the primary hub, primary target for China developments and foreign policy in the upcoming decades. And I trust that Mekong issue will be among one of the the hottest issues. But we hope also, and message to China, that China should not play Mekong rivers against South China Sea. When South China Sea is too hot, please do not make use of Mekong rivers to cover the dispute on South China Sea. We hope that Chinese will come with come here to cooperate, not only on good wills, but also this is by nature, we are neighbors. And Mekong is the Mekong. Mekong cannot be used to cover something different on the other side of China and ASEAN relations. So that is our message. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Dr. Tai. And geography matters here. So I think the maritime ASEAN countries, governments are more concerned maybe on the South China Sea, whereas the mainland more concerned on the Mekong. Kun Kavi, would you have any last comment to make?
I think Dr. Tai answered the questions already. It is true that Mekong appears in various ASEAN documents, but attention was not there. But I think from now on, the focus, not only in China, but geopolitics has moved to Mekong, and I think more engagement from ASEAN will increase. But in what form and in what scope, I think we have to still watch how ASEAN want to deal with it. Because one thing that ASEAN learned from South China Sea is that when you have too many parties not involving and also help in the discussion, it could cause a lot of problems.
Mr. Lee Hong, the Mekong mainland region is not on the belt or no on the road, but it's connected through a corridor. And now the train is going to come down from Kunming, is being constructed in Laos. So, what is from your view, China's outlook? How do we understand China's intentions, aims overall? You have issues in the South China Sea, you have dams in the Mekong, you have very ambitious Belt and Road scheme. What does China want to get out of all this?
First of all, to your question, the Belt and Road Initiative is an open initiative. It has no specific geographic position of this Belt and Road. Any initiative, any development plan which want to connect it with it, we can connect it and then expand the road. So this is the Chinese strategy philosophy of BRI. So in the Southeast Asia, we have an economic corridor, a China-ASEAN economic corridor, Southeast Asia economic corridor, but as it can be expanded, connected with Thailand, EEC, connected to the wetlands economic plan. I don't remember the name. So all this can be connected. This is the initiative of BRI. So in our view, BRI is just a platform. We provided guidance for industries, for different countries, to working together, to have some area, some economic belt, which can attract more investment for economic booming. So this is the philosophy for BRI. With regard to our former colleague mentioned about the waterway, and all those countries, Japan, Americans, Australians, they do have interests on the waterway. But if we look back for the last 30 years, there's no problem at all for the free passing on the waterway. Every year, there are more than 100,000 ships passing through the South China Sea waterway. None of them is encountered with problem for navigation. So I think with this such frequent waterway, we need installations to address the problems instead of military activities, militarization process. So this is the waterway I would like to mention about. As for Lancang-Mekong relations with ASEAN, I'm sure when we Chinese mentioned this Lancang-Mekong cooperation, we are working together with Thailand and other countries, we keep in mind two things in our mind. The first is ASEAN master plan. The LMC must be complementary to ASEAN master plan for economic development. The other one is this Lancang-Mekong cooperation mechanism should work under the new development framework. That is 2030 agenda of the UN. So this has been put into the text of the first declaration among our leaders. So these are the two premises for this cooperation. So I'm sure they have some connections. But water issue on Mekong is completely different from the South China Sea issues. And I am sure China will have no intention to combine or to make linkage between these two issues. These are separate issues. And water issues on the Mekong, in my view, should be the primary role should be solved by these 6 countries along the Lancang Mekong. Of course, the other countries from the ASEAN could play in a role, but the primary role should be done to the river, riparian countries on the river. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry we've run over time a little bit, but I think we have succeeded today in trying to see Southeast Asia, ASEAN, and China relations around 2 arenas, not just South China Sea, but the Mekong region as well. And they should be seen as one and the same, in the same picture, in the same frame. I want to thank our speakers. We've touched on a lot of issues today, I think, and I think we've had a frank discussion. So thank you very much, Dr. Tran Viet Thai, coming from Hanoi overnight just to be with us today. Dr. Carl Middleton, and Mr. Lee Hong, Kun Kavi Chongkittavorn. Please join me in thanking them. And thank you very much.